The quiet decline of great empires. A calm 2-hour history of economic decline. Tonight, we explore a story that unfolds slowly. Not in moments of chaos, but across decades, sometimes centuries. A story about time, systems, and the quiet forces that shape civilizations. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing to analyze. Simply allow the ideas to drift past, like distant echoes from the past. Before we continue, let me gently welcome you. My name is Francis, and I'll be your host for this calm journey through economic history. If you enjoy this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling, you may wish to stay with us here at Silent Economy. New long-form histories are added quietly over time. Now, as you settle into a comfortable position, we can begin exploring how great empires rarely end suddenly, but instead slowly, almost imperceptibly, weaken from within. Chapter 1. The slow nature of decline. When we think about the end of empires, our minds often conjure dramatic images. Cities burning, armies defeated, governments overthrown. These moments do occur, of course, and they mark important turning points in history. But they are rarely the whole story. More often, they are the final, visible symptoms of processes that have been unfolding quietly for generations. Economic decline, in particular, is a gradual phenomenon. It happens slowly, in ways that are difficult to perceive from inside the system. A currency loses a small percentage of its purchasing power each year. Tax revenues fall slightly short of projections. Trade balances shift incrementally. Administrative costs creep upward. None of these changes seems catastrophic in isolation, but accumulated over decades, they transform the economic foundations of a civilization. Historians generally recognize that major civilizations pass through phases. There is typically a period of expansion and growth, when the empire is vigorous, adaptive, and successful. Resources flow inward. Institutions are flexible and responsive. Problems, when they arise, are addressed with energy and innovation. This phase can last for many generations, creating the impression of permanence, of a natural order that will continue indefinitely. Then comes a period of maturity, a kind of plateau. The empire has reached its greatest extent. Its institutions are well established. Its culture has developed sophistication and complexity. This period can also last for a very long time. To those living within it, this maturity might appear as stability. The systems work, more or less. Life continues in familiar patterns. There may be challenges, certainly, but they seem manageable within existing frameworks. What's less obvious during this mature phase is that the seeds of decline have often already been planted. The very success of the empire creates conditions that will eventually undermine it. Expansion creates administrative burdens that grow heavier over time. Complexity creates rigidity. Established interests become entrenched, resisting changes that might threaten their position. The flexibility that characterized the earlier growth phase gradually gives way to institutional inertia. Decline, when it begins, is often invisible to contemporaries. It manifests first in subtle ways. Economic growth slows, but perhaps this seems like a natural settling after rapid expansion. Tax revenues fail to keep pace with expenses, but governments find ways to manage, at least for a while. The quality of infrastructure deteriorates slightly, but not dramatically. Services become a bit less efficient, but still function adequately. People living through early decline often don't recognize it as such. They might notice that things aren't quite as good as they used to be, that the economy isn't growing as robustly as in their parents' or grandparents' time. But these changes can be attributed to many factors. Perhaps it's just a temporary downturn. Perhaps standards of living were unrealistically high before. Perhaps the current challenges are just normal fluctuations that every society experiences. This inability to recognize decline while it's happening is not a failure of intelligence or perception. It's a natural consequence of how gradual the process is. When change happens incrementally, year by year, it's difficult to see the overall trend. Each individual year might look reasonably similar to the previous one. It's only when you compare conditions separated by a generation or more that the extent of change becomes apparent. There's also a psychological dimension to this blindness. People are invested in their societies, in believing that their way of life will continue. Recognizing fundamental decline requires accepting uncomfortable truths about systems and institutions that have provided security and prosperity. It's easier, psychologically, to interpret problems as temporary aberrations rather than symptoms of deeper structural issues. Economic historians have identified several patterns that tend to characterize imperial decline. These aren't universal laws, and each civilization follows its own particular path. But certain themes recur with striking frequency across different times and places. Understanding these patterns can help us see how decline unfolds, how economic foundations gradually erode even as daily life appears to continue normally. One common pattern involves fiscal imbalance. Empires at their peak often develop expensive commitments. Military forces must be maintained to defend far-flung borders. Administrative systems grow more elaborate to manage increasingly complex societies. Infrastructure requires constant maintenance and periodic renewal. Social programs, once established, create expectations that are politically difficult to reverse. These commitments might be sustainable during periods of strong economic growth, when tax revenues are expanding. But if growth slows or reverses, while commitments remain fixed or even increase, a gap opens between revenues and expenditures. Governments have several options for managing this gap, and the choices they make can accelerate or postpone decline, but rarely avoid it entirely if the underlying economic foundations are weakening. Another recurring pattern involves monetary systems. Sound currency, backed by trust and maintained with discipline, facilitates trade and economic activity. But governments facing fiscal pressures may be tempted to debase their currency, to reduce the precious metal content of coins, or to print money beyond what the economy can sustainably absorb. This provides short-term relief from financial stress, but at the cost of eroding monetary trust over the long term. Trade networks represent another vulnerable area. Empires often depend on complex trading relationships, importing essential goods from distant regions, exporting products to foreign markets. These networks can be fragile. If trading partners develop their own industries, demand for imports may decline. If transportation routes become less secure or more expensive, trade becomes less profitable, If the empire's products lose their competitive edge, exports suffer. Institutional rigidity, too, plays an important role in many stories of decline. Organizations and systems that were innovative and effective when first established can become hidebound over time. Rules that once served clear purposes become mere tradition. Bureaucracies develop their own interests, focused more on self-perpetuation than on serving broader societal needs. The capacity for adaptation, for responding creatively to new challenges, diminishes. As you listen to these general observations, you might find your mind wandering to specific historical examples, or perhaps to questions about how these patterns might apply in different contexts. That's perfectly natural. Let your thoughts drift where they will. We have hours ahead of us, and we'll be exploring several specific cases in detail. For now, just absorb the basic idea. Decline is slow, often invisible, and characterized by recurring patterns that transcend individual civilization. There's something almost peaceful about understanding this slow nature of decline. It removes the urgency, the panic that comes from imagining sudden catastrophe. Empires don't usually end in a day or a year. They fade gradually, sometimes over centuries. This slowness means that people living through decline can still have full, meaningful lives. Markets still function. Communities still exist. Culture still flourishes, sometimes even reaching new heights of sophistication during periods of political and economic decline. The Roman Empire, which we'll explore in our next chapter, existed in a state of gradual decline for several centuries, depending on how you measure it. Yet, during much of this period, life for most inhabitants continued in familiar patterns. Art and literature flourished. Legal systems remained sophisticated. Trade networks, though perhaps less extensive than at the empire's peak, still connected diverse regions. Decline was real, but it coexisted with continued civilization. This perspective isn't meant to minimize the challenges and suffering that can accompany economic decline. People's lives are affected. Opportunities diminish. Standards of living may fall. Political instability can increase. But understanding the gradual nature of these processes helps us see them more clearly, without the distorting lens of catastrophism. So as we move forward into our examination of specific historical examples, carry with you this understanding of decline as a slow process, unfolding over generations, often invisible to those living through it, characterized by gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. This framework will help us interpret the stories we're about to explore, to see the common threads that connect different civilizations separated by centuries and continents. Take a deep breath. Let yourself relax a bit more deeply. We're just beginning our journey, and there's no rush. Let's take our time together as we turn now to our first detailed example: the long, slow economic transformation of ancient Rome. Chapter 2. Rome, Currency, Power, and Time. When we speak of Rome, we're actually speaking of a civilization that endured, in various forms, for more than 1,000 years. From the founding of the Republic in the 6th century before the Common Era, through the imperial period, to the final end of the Western Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era, Rome was a dominant force in the Mediterranean world and beyond. This extraordinary longevity makes Rome particularly interesting for understanding long-term economic processes. The economic foundation of Rome's power was built during the Republic and the early imperial period. Conquest brought vast territories under Roman control, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. These conquests generated enormous wealth, both directly through plunder and tribute, and indirectly through the expansion of trade networks. Rome became the center of a vast economic system, drawing resources from across the known world. The Roman currency system, based initially on the silver denarius, facilitated trade across this vast empire. Roman coins were trusted, accepted far beyond the empire's borders. This monetary system was one of Rome's great achievements, creating a zone of economic predictability and facilitating commerce on a scale previously unknown in the ancient world. But even at the height of Rome's power, the seeds of long-term economic challenges were being planted. The very extent of the empire created administrative burdens. Distant frontiers needed defending. Roads and aqueducts required maintenance. A growing bureaucracy needed funding. The costs of empire, which had been easily covered during the expansionist phase when conquest brought steady inflows of wealth, became more challenging to sustain once expansion slowed or ceased. Let's talk for a moment about Roman currency, because what happened to it over several centuries illustrates beautifully the slow nature of economic decline. In the early empire, the denarius contained approximately 95% silver. It was a substantial, trustworthy coin. Merchants across the Mediterranean accepted it readily. It held its value reliably over time. Over the following centuries, emperors facing financial pressures gradually reduced the silver content of the denarius. Each individual reduction was small, perhaps barely noticeable. A coin that was 90% silver looks much the same as one that's 95% silver. And if the government declares both to be of equal value, people generally accept that declaration, at least initially. This process of debasement continued intermittently over several hundred years. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the denarius contained only about 5% silver. What had begun as a silver coin had become essentially a copper coin with a thin silver coating. This transformation happened so gradually that no single generation experienced a dramatic change. Each emperor reduced the silver content just a bit more than his predecessor, and life went on. But the cumulative effect was profound. As the real value of the currency declined, prices rose to compensate. Merchants needed more coins to purchase the same goods. People holding savings in cash saw their purchasing power erode. Those on fixed incomes found themselves increasingly unable to maintain their standard of living. The monetary system, which had been a source of stability and economic efficiency, became a source of instability and distrust. Why did emperors engage in this debasement? The answer lies in the fiscal pressures they faced. Military expenses were substantial and growing. The legions that defended the empire's vast frontiers required pay, equipment, and supplies. Civil administration was expensive. Public works projects, which helped maintain political support and economic infrastructure, needed funding. Imperial courts and bureaucracies consumed resources. Tax revenue, meanwhile, was not keeping pace with these expenses. The economy was not growing as rapidly as in earlier periods. Some regions were experiencing decline. Collection systems were becoming less efficient. Raising taxes was politically difficult and risked provoking resistance. Debasement offered an alternative. The government could pay its debts with coins that contained less precious metal, effectively creating more money without formally raising taxes. This worked, after a fashion, for quite a long time. The military got paid. Bureaucrats received their salaries. Public works continued. The immediate fiscal crisis was postponed. But the long-term cost was the gradual erosion of the monetary system's credibility. Each generation inherited a currency that was slightly less trustworthy than the one their parents had known. And they passed on to their children a currency that was even weaker still. I'm glad you're staying with me through these details about currency and silver content. These might seem like dry, technical matters, but they reveal something important about how economic decline unfolds. It's not usually dramatic. It's not about sudden disasters. It's about small compromises repeated over and over, each one individually justifiable, each one making the next one a bit easier, until the cumulative effect becomes transformative. The military pressures Rome faced were also growing over time. In the earlier empire, Roman legions were generally superior to any forces they encountered. Military operations, while expensive, were usually successful and often paid for themselves through conquest and plunder. But as the empire matured, the military situation became more challenging. Enemies beyond the frontiers were adapting, learning from their encounters with Rome, developing more sophisticated military capabilities. The Germans, the Persians, and other peoples beyond the empire's borders were no longer easy to defeat. Military campaigns became longer and more expensive. Victory was less certain. And unlike the earlier expansionist phase, successful military operations no longer brought significant new territories and resources under Roman control. The size of the military establishment itself grew over time. More troops were needed to defend longer frontiers. Defensive warfare is more manpower intensive than offensive warfare. You need forces distributed along the entire frontier, not just concentrated for particular campaigns. The cost of maintaining these forces was substantial and rising. Administrative costs were also increasing. As the empire matured, its bureaucracy became more elaborate and complex. More officials were needed to manage taxation, administer justice, oversee public works, regulate trade, and handle the countless other functions of government. These bureaucrats needed to be paid, housed, and equipped. The administrative apparatus, which had been relatively lean during the Republic and early Empire, became progressively more elaborate and expensive. There was also the challenge of maintaining infrastructure over a vast territory. Rome had built an extraordinary network of roads, aqueducts, ports, and public buildings. This infrastructure facilitated trade, administration, and military movement. But it required constant maintenance and periodic renewal. Roads needed repair. Aqueducts needed cleaning and fixing. Harbours needed dredging. The costs were manageable during periods of economic growth, but became burdensome as growth slowed. Let yourself breathe slowly as we consider these accumulating pressures. None of them was individually catastrophic. Rome didn't suddenly run out of silver or suddenly face unbeatable military enemies or suddenly find its roads impassable. Instead, each challenge grew gradually more severe over many decades and centuries. The empire adapted, finding ways to manage, at least for a time. But the adaptations often created their own problems or postponed rather than solved the underlying issues. Trade patterns were also shifting in ways that affected Rome's economic vitality. The early empire had benefited from being the dominant economic power in its region, both producing and consuming goods on a massive scale. Roman manufacturers and craftsmen had competitive advantages. But over time, economic development spread to other regions. Provinces that had initially imported manufactured goods from Italy began producing their own. Trade, which had initially concentrated toward Rome, became more dispersed and regional. This wasn't necessarily harmful to the empire as a whole, but it did shift economic power and tax revenue away from the core toward the periphery. It also meant that the central government had less direct control over economic activity. Regional economies became more self-sufficient, which in some ways was healthy, but which also reduced the economic integration that had been one of Rome's strengths. Agricultural productivity, the foundation of any ancient economy, may also have been declining in some regions. Intensive cultivation over many centuries may have depleted soils. Climate variations, though difficult to assess with certainty at this historical distance, may have affected growing conditions. Some agricultural regions that had been highly productive seem to have become less so over time. This would have reduced both food supplies and tax revenues, adding to fiscal pressures. By the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, the cumulative effect of these various pressures was creating serious challenges. The economy was weaker. The currency was substantially debased. Military threats were more severe. Administrative costs were higher. Yet the empire continued to function. Cities still stood. Trade still occurred. People still went about their daily lives. The decline, though real, was gradual enough that each generation could adapt to the new normal. The Western Roman Empire's eventual fragmentation in the 5th century was the culmination of these long-term processes, not a sudden event. By the time Germanic peoples established their own kingdoms in what had been Roman territory, the empire had already been economically and administratively weakening for generations. What finally happened was less a dramatic collapse than a recognition that the old system could no longer sustain itself, that new arrangements were needed. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years, demonstrating that decline, even when advanced, is not necessarily irreversible. But that's another story. For our purposes, Rome illustrates beautifully how economic decline unfolds over very long periods, how seemingly minor problems compound over time, how each generation inherits and passes on challenges that are slightly more severe than what they received. Rest for a moment in these thoughts. The story of Rome is a story of centuries, of slow transformations that would have been invisible to any individual living through them. It's a story about the difficulty of maintaining vast systems over long periods, about the subtle ways that success creates future challenges, about the gradual nature of change. Chapter 3. Spain. Wealth without stability. Let's take our time now as we move forward many centuries, from ancient Rome to early modern Spain. The Spain we'll be discussing is the Spain of the 16th and 17th centuries, a time when Spanish power seemed unlimited, when Spanish ships dominated the oceans, when Spanish kings ruled over vast territories in Europe and the Americas. This was Spain at the height of its imperial glory. Yet within this apparent strength lay the seeds of long-term economic vulnerability. The foundation of Spain's 16th century power was the astonishing wealth flowing from the Americas. Spanish conquistadors had subdued the Aztec and Inca empires, gaining access to their accumulated treasures. Even more significantly, they had discovered and developed massive silver mines, particularly the legendary mountain of Potosi in what is now Bolivia. For more than a century, enormous quantities of silver flowed from these mines to Spain, creating what seemed like unlimited wealth. Imagine the excitement, the sense of power and possibility that must have accompanied this influx of precious metal. Spain received wealth on a scale unprecedented in European history. The Spanish crown could fund armies, build palaces, wage wars, support the arts, and generally behave as the most powerful monarchy in Christendom. The future must have seemed bright indeed. Yet this very abundance created profound economic challenges. This is one of the great paradoxes of economic history. Sometimes rapid wealth acquisition can undermine long-term economic health. The mechanisms through which this happens are subtle and often invisible to contemporaries, but they're quite clear when we examine them from our comfortable distance of several centuries. One immediate effect of the silver influx was inflation. As more money entered circulation, while the quantity of goods and services remained relatively constant, prices rose. This is a basic economic principle. If the money supply increases faster than the real economy grows, the purchasing power of each unit of money declines. Spain experienced significant price inflation during the 16th century, eroding the real value of incomes and savings. But the effects extended well beyond simple price increases. The abundance of American silver created what economic historians sometimes call the Spanish disease or Dutch disease, after later examples of the same phenomenon. Essentially, the massive inflow of wealth made other economic activities less competitive and attractive. Think about it from the perspective of a Spanish entrepreneur or craftsman in the 16th century. You could invest your time and capital in manufacturing, agriculture, or trade. These activities require effort, skill, and risk. Or you could position yourself to capture some of the silver flowing from the Americas through government service, court connections, or involvement in the American trade. The second option must have seemed far more attractive to many people. This created a structural problem for the Spanish economy. Industries that might have developed, skills that might have been cultivated, were neglected in favour of rent-seeking behaviours aimed at capturing shares of the American silver. Spain's manufacturing sector, which had shown promise in the 15th century, failed to develop as robustly as it might have. Agricultural production remained relatively stagnant. Entrepreneurial energies were directed toward unproductive activities. Meanwhile, Spain's neighbours, particularly the Dutch and the English, were developing more diversified and resilient economies. They built industries, improved agricultural productivity, developed sophisticated financial systems, and expanded trade networks. They didn't have access to American silver, at least not directly, but this apparent disadvantage may have actually served them well, forcing them to develop other sources of economic strength. I want you to notice something here, something important about the nature of economic decline. Spain wasn't being invaded. It wasn't experiencing natural disasters. It was actually receiving vast quantities of the most valued commodity of the age. Yet this apparent blessing was gradually undermining the foundations of sustainable economic prosperity. Wealth, it turns out, is not the same as economic health. A society can be rich while becoming weaker. The Spanish crown's fiscal behaviour also illustrated a common pattern in imperial decline. The availability of American silver enabled kings to pursue ambitious and expensive policies, particularly military campaigns aimed at maintaining and expanding Spanish power in Europe. Spain was almost constantly at war during this period, fighting in the Netherlands, in Italy, against France, against the Ottoman Empire, in defense of Catholicism, against Protestantism. These military commitments were extraordinarily expensive. Even the vast wealth flowing from America was not sufficient to cover their costs. The Spanish crown repeatedly borrowed money, issuing bonds and taking loans from international bankers. The availability of silver made creditors willing to lend, confident that Spain could service its debts. But the debts accumulated faster than the silver arrived. Spain declared bankruptcy, or what we might call sovereign default, multiple times during the 16th and 17th centuries. The Crown would announce that it could not meet its debt obligations and would negotiate restructuring with creditors. These defaults were disruptive, but not fatal. Creditors would eventually agree to new terms, and the cycle would begin again. The Crown would borrow, spend on military campaigns, find itself unable to service the debt, and default once more. Let yourself reflect on this pattern for a moment. Breathe slowly. Consider how a country could be receiving enormous wealth from overseas, yet still be unable to meet its financial obligations. This apparent contradiction reveals something important. It's not the absolute level of wealth that matters most, but the relationship between resources and commitments, between income and expenditure, between productive capacity and consumption. The silver flowing from America also passed through Spain rather quickly, flowing onward to other parts of Europe. Spain imported many manufactured goods from other countries. Spanish nobles and wealthy individuals had expensive tastes for foreign luxuries. The Crown itself spent heavily on foreign military contractors and suppliers. Much of the American silver that arrived in Seville soon departed for Genoa, Amsterdam, or other financial centres, used to pay for imports or to service debts. This pattern meant that while Spain had nominal access to great wealth, that wealth did not necessarily translate into domestic economic development. Other countries benefited from Spanish silver, using it to develop their industries and financial systems. Spain, meanwhile, remained dependent on imports and on the continued flow of silver from America. When that flow eventually declined, as mines became exhausted or less productive, Spain found itself without the robust domestic economy that might have sustained its power. By the 17th century, Spain's relative position was declining markedly. The country was still powerful and still wealthy in absolute terms. Spanish kings still ruled over vast territories, but other powers were rising, developing economic and military capabilities that would eventually surpass Spain's. The Dutch Republic, despite its small size, was becoming an economic powerhouse. England was developing its maritime and commercial strength. France was consolidating and strengthening. Spain's experience illustrates a pattern we might call wealth without foundations. The silver from America created an illusion of prosperity and power, but it didn't build the institutional and economic structures needed for sustainable strength. Manufacturing, agriculture, finance, trade networks, human capital development. These are the foundations of durable economic power. External wealth can supplement these foundations, but it cannot replace them. The decline of Spanish power unfolded over more than a century. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic event that marked the end of Spanish dominance. Instead, there was a gradual fading, a slow recognition that Spain was no longer the preeminent power it had been. By the 18th century, Spain had become a second-tier power, still significant, but no longer dominant, still wealthy in some respects, but economically weaker than its rivals. As we rest in these reflections about Spain, notice the contrast with Rome. Rome's decline involved the debasement of currency and the erosion of productive capacity built up over centuries. Spain's decline involved the failure to build durable productive capacity despite access to enormous wealth. Different paths, similar outcomes, gradual economic weakening that reduced power and influence over time. Take a moment now. Breathe. Let these historical patterns settle in your mind. We're not rushing anywhere. There's plenty of time ahead of us. When you're ready, we'll continue our journey, moving forward to examine another pattern of imperial decline. This time in 18th century France. Chapter 4: France, Debt and Imbalance. We move now into the 18th century, to France under the later Bourbon kings. This is France before its great transformation, before the events of 1789 that would reshape French society and send ripples across all of Europe. We're interested in the economic conditions that developed over many decades. The gradual accumulation of fiscal stress that characterized the old regime. France in the 18th century was, in many ways, the most powerful and sophisticated nation in Europe. It had the largest population of any major European power. Its culture was admired and imitated across the continent. French was the language of diplomacy and polite society. Paris was a centre of learning, art, dot, and fashion. The French court at Versailles represented the pinnacle of royal magnificence. Yet beneath this cultural brilliance and apparent strength lay a fiscal system under growing strain. The French monarchy faced persistent deficits, spending more than it collected in revenue year after year. These deficits were not huge in any individual year, but they accumulated over time, creating a growing burden of debt that became increasingly difficult to manage. Let's explore this situation slowly and carefully, because it illustrates important principles about fiscal sustainability and the slow accumulation of economic stress. The French government had substantial expenses. It maintained a large military, engaged in periodic wars, supported an elaborate court and bureaucracy, funded public works, and provided various services. These were normal functions of government, and France was not necessarily more extravagant than other European powers in absolute terms. The revenue side of the equation, however, was problematic. France had a complex and inefficient tax system, characterized by numerous exemptions, privileges, and special arrangements. The nobility and clergy, who together owned vast amounts of land and wealth, were largely exempt from direct taxation. Regional variations meant that tax burdens were distributed unevenly across the kingdom. Collection systems were often farmed out to private individuals who kept a portion of what they collected. This tax system had developed over centuries, accumulating layers of tradition, privilege, and special arrangements. Each exemption and privilege had its own history, its own justification, its own constituency defending it. Reform was politically difficult. Those who benefited from exemptions resisted any changes. Regional authorities defended their particular arrangements. Vested interests were numerous and powerful. The burden of taxation therefore fell disproportionately on those least able to bear it: peasants and the urban working classes. They paid various direct and indirect taxes, tolls, and fees. The weight of these obligations was substantial, limiting their purchasing power and quality of life. Meanwhile, those with the greatest capacity to pay, the wealthy nobility and church, contributed relatively little to state finances. Various finance ministers throughout the 18th century recognized these structural problems and attempted reforms. They proposed broader-based taxation, more efficient collection systems, reduction of exemptions. Some of these proposals were quite sophisticated, reflecting genuine understanding of fiscal principles. But political resistance was strong. Powerful interests blocked meaningful reform. Kings, while sometimes sympathetic to reform ideas, were reluctant to confront the nobility and other privileged groups on whom they depended for political support. So the deficits continued, year after year. The government borrowed to cover the gap between revenues and expenditures. France had access to credit, as lenders believed in the kingdom's fundamental solvency and expected that debts would be serviced. But borrowing creates obligations. Interest must be paid. Eventually, principal must be repaid or refinanced. As debt accumulated, an increasing share of government revenue went to servicing that debt, leaving less available for other purposes. Breathe slowly as we consider this fiscal trap. It's a subtle thing, a gradual tightening of constraints. Each year's deficit seems manageable. Each new loan seems reasonable. But over decades, the accumulated debt grows, and the interest obligations become a larger and larger burden. Eventually, you reach a point where a significant portion of your revenue goes just to paying interest on past borrowing, constraining your ability to respond to new challenges or needs. France's fiscal problems were exacerbated by periodic wars, which were expensive and unpredictable. The 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century was particularly costly. Support for the American independence movement, a few decades later, added further to the debt burden. These military commitments were driven by strategic and political considerations, but they had significant fiscal consequences that compounded the underlying structural problems. By the 1780s, the French fiscal situation had become genuinely precarious. Debt had accumulated to levels that strained the government's ability to service it. A large portion of state revenue was committed to interest payments. The tax system remained inefficient and inequitable. Attempts at reform continued to encounter political resistance. The government was running out of options for managing the situation within the existing framework. It's important to understand that this was a slow-motion crisis, decades in the making. Each year, was similar to the previous year. The government functioned. Taxes were collected. Debts were serviced. The military remained in the field. The court continued its elaborate ceremonies. To an observer, things might have appeared normal, or at least sustainably manageable. The underlying fiscal stress was not immediately visible in daily life. The eventual fiscal crisis of the late 1780s, which contributed to the calling of the Estates General and the subsequent political upheaval, was the culmination of these long-term trends. It wasn't a sudden development, but the flowering of seeds planted decades earlier. The final manifestation of structural problems that had been building gradually over time. France's experience illustrates how fiscal imbalance can accumulate slowly, how each generation can inherit slightly more difficult circumstances than the previous generation faced. It shows how political and social structures can prevent necessary adaptations, how vested interests can block reforms even when the need for reform is increasingly apparent. It demonstrates that economic problems, even when clearly identified by some observers, may prove impossible to address through existing institutional frameworks. The French case also reveals something about the relationship between economics and politics. The fiscal crisis didn't occur in isolation. It was intertwined with questions about privilege, fairness, representation, and power. Economic stress created pressure for political change, while political structures prevented the economic adjustments that might have relieved that stress. This interaction between economic and political factors is characteristic of many episodes of imperial or national decline. As you rest with these thoughts about 18th century France, notice again the slow accumulation of problems, the gradual tightening of constraints. Notice how each individual year might seem manageable, while the long-term trend is clearly unsustainable. Notice how political and institutional factors can prevent solutions even when problems are recognized. Let yourself settle more deeply now. We're moving into the quieter parts of our journey together. The pace will slow. The examples will continue, but with more space for reflection, more room for your own thoughts to wander and drift. Take a long, low breath. When you're ready, we'll continue to our next chapter, examining economic rigidity in a very different kind of system. Chapter 5: The Soviet Union, rigidity over time. We move forward now through the centuries to the 20th century, to a very different kind of system, a different kind of empire. The Soviet Union represented an experiment in organizing economic life according to principles fundamentally different from those we've been discussing in earlier chapters. It's worth examining because it illustrates yet another pattern of long-term economic decline, one based not on fiscal stress or currency debasement, but on structural rigidity and the gradual accumulation of inefficiency. The Soviet system, established after the events of 1917, was built on the principle of central planning. The state owned the means of production and directed economic activity through detailed plans. Bureaucrats in Moscow would decide what should be produced, in what quantities, using what inputs, and at what prices. This was an enormous undertaking, attempting to coordinate an entire economy through conscious planning rather than through market mechanisms. In its early decades, this system achieved significant results. The Soviet Union industrialized rapidly, transforming from a largely agricultural society into an industrial power. It mobilized resources for massive projects. It achieved near universal literacy. During the Second World War, it produced the military equipment needed to defeat Nazi Germany. For a time, the system seemed to work, at least in terms of achieving the goals its planners set. Yet even during this period of apparent success, certain characteristics of the system were creating long-term vulnerabilities. Central planning is inherently rigid. Plans are made years in advance and are difficult to adjust. This rigidity makes it hard to respond to changing circumstances, to new information, to unexpected problems. In a market economy, thousands of individual decisions made by countless people responding to prices and their own local knowledge create flexibility and adaptability. In a planned economy, all decisions flow through hierarchical channels, creating bottlenecks and delays. The incentive structure of the Soviet system also created problems. Managers of factories and farms were judged on whether they met planned targets, usually measured in quantitative terms. Tons of steel produced, hectares of wheat harvested, numbers of tractors manufactured. This created an incentive to meet those specific targets, regardless of quality, efficiency, or actual usefulness. If the plan called for a certain number of nails, factories might produce many small, useless nails or a few enormously heavy ones, both approaches meeting the quantitative target while failing to provide what was actually needed. Innovation was discouraged by this system. Why take the risk of trying something new when your performance is judged by meeting established plan targets? Why suggest more efficient production methods when that might result in your targets being increased next year, making your job harder? The system rewarded conformity and meeting quotas, not creativity or improvement. These characteristics didn't cause immediate problems. The system could direct resources toward priority sectors and achieve impressive results in those areas. Heavy industry, military production, space technology. The Soviet Union excelled in these domains. But the cumulative effect over decades was an economy that was increasingly inefficient, that allocated resources poorly, that failed to innovate, that produced goods that people didn't particularly want or need. Let's talk about consumer goods for a moment. In market economies, businesses have strong incentives to produce what consumers want, in the qualities and quantities they desire, because that's how businesses profit. Competition drives innovation and efficiency. Poor quality or unwanted products don't sell, and companies that can't satisfy consumers fail. This creates a responsive system, constantly adjusting to changing preferences and needs. In the Soviet system, there was no such mechanism. Central planners decided what consumer goods should be produced, but they had limited information about what people actually wanted. Factories had no incentive to produce high-quality goods or to innovate in product design. Shops stocked what they were allocated, regardless of whether people wanted it. The result was chronic shortages of desirable goods and surpluses of unwanted products. People would queue for hours to purchase basic items. Quality was poor. Variety was limited. Agricultural production faced similar problems. Collective farms were judged on meeting production quotas, not on efficiency or profitability. The incentive structure discouraged initiative and careful husbandry of resources. Soviet agriculture, despite enormous investments and despite the country's vast agricultural lands, was chronically inefficient. The Soviet Union, at various points, had to import grain from abroad, a telling indicator of agricultural failure for such a large country with significant agricultural potential. Military spending represented another drain on the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union maintained enormous military forces and invested heavily in military technology. These expenditures were necessary, from the perspective of Soviet leaders, to maintain security and international influence. But they consumed resources that might otherwise have been invested in civilian production or infrastructure. The burden of military spending as a percentage of total economic output was substantially higher in the Soviet Union than in most Western countries. By the 1970s and 80s, these accumulated inefficiencies were taking a visible toll. Economic growth was slowing. Technology was falling behind Western standards in many areas. Consumer dissatisfaction was growing. The system was becoming increasingly sclerotic, unable to adapt or reform itself. Various leaders attempted reforms, recognizing that changes were needed, but the system resisted transformation. Vested interests, bureaucratic inertia, and ideological constraints made meaningful reform extremely difficult. Breathe slowly as you consider this pattern. It's different from what we saw in Rome or Spain or France. Yet there are common themes. In each case, a system that initially worked, that achieved real successes, gradually developed characteristics that undermined its long-term viability. In each case, the decline was slow enough that each generation could normalize the problems it faced. In each case, reform proved difficult because of institutional rigidity and vested interests. The eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the culmination of these long-term economic weaknesses, combined with political and social factors. The system had been showing signs of strain for decades. The final events occurred relatively quickly, but they were the endpoint of a long process of gradual economic decline and loss of legitimacy. The Soviet case illustrates how economic systems can lose adaptability over time, how institutional structures can become obstacles to necessary change, how the accumulation of inefficiency can gradually erode an economy's vitality. It shows that decline can occur even in the absence of external shocks or dramatic events, simply through the slow compounding of systemic problems. Rest now in these reflections. We've examined several very different systems, different times, different places, different organizing principles. Yet certain patterns emerge again and again. Let yourself notice these patterns. Let them settle in your mind as we prepare for our final chapter, where we'll synthesize what we've learned. Chapter 6: Patterns that Repeat. We've traveled together through many centuries, through different civilizations and different systems. From ancient Rome to early modern Spain, from pre-revolutionary France to the 20th century Soviet Union. We've examined how economic decline unfolds over long periods of time. Now, in this final chapter, let's step back and consider the patterns that seem to repeat, the common threads that connect these diverse stories. First, we might notice that decline is almost always gradual. This has been our central theme from the beginning. Empires and powerful states don't typically collapse suddenly. Instead, they weaken over decades or even centuries. Each year might look similar to the previous year. Each generation might experience conditions that seem normal, even if they're objectively worse than what previous generations knew. The slow pace of decline makes it difficult for contemporaries to recognize what's happening. This gradual nature means that people can live full lives even during periods of decline. Markets still function. Societies still maintain their cultures and institutions. The sun still rises each day. Decline doesn't mean the end of civilization or the collapse of daily life. It means a slow weakening, a gradual loss of vitality and capability, a fading of power and influence over time. A second pattern involves fiscal and monetary stress. We saw this in different forms in each of our examples. Rome debased its currency to meet expenses. Spain's fiscal system couldn't keep pace with its commitments despite massive silver imports. France accumulated unsustainable debt while maintaining an inequitable tax system. The Soviet Union, though it didn't have debt in the conventional sense, consumed resources inefficiently and imposed heavy military burdens on its economy. The specific mechanisms varied, but the underlying pattern was similar. A gap between resources and commitments, between revenue and expenditure. between productive capacity and consumption. When this gap persists and widens over time, it creates stress that eventually manifests in various forms of economic dysfunction. Monetary trust, in particular, appears repeatedly as a crucial factor. When people trust their currency, economic activity flourishes. When that trust erodes, whether through debasement, inflation, or other mechanisms, economic efficiency suffers. Rome's experience with currency debasement, Spain's inflation, these illustrate how monetary dysfunction can undermine economic foundations gradually but profoundly. A third pattern involves institutional rigidity. In each of our examples, we saw systems that had difficulty adapting to changing circumstances. Rome's administrative and military structures, developed during the expansionist phase, became burdensome during the mature phase. Spain's economy failed to develop productive capacity because existing arrangements favoured rent-seeking over entrepreneurship. France's political system prevented tax reform despite obvious need. The Soviet Union's planning apparatus resisted innovation and efficiency. Institutions that are flexible and adaptive during a civilization's growth phase often become rigid and resistant to change as the civilization matures. Vested interests develop, defending existing arrangements even when those arrangements no longer serve broader societal needs. Rules and procedures that once had clear purposes become mere tradition. The capacity for creative response to new challenges diminishes. Let yourself breathe slowly as we consider these patterns. Notice how they connect across our different examples. Notice how different the specific circumstances were, yet how similar the underlying dynamics. This suggests something important, that there are recurring patterns in how complex economic systems weaken over time. Patterns that transcend particular circumstances and appear across different eras and cultures. A fourth pattern involves what we might call the paradox of success. Success creates its own challenges. Military success leads to expanded territories that must be defended and administered. Economic success leads to complexity that must be managed. Political success leads to vested interests that resist change. The very achievements that define an empire's peak also sow the seeds of future difficulties. Spain's American silver is perhaps the clearest example of this paradox. What seemed like an unlimited blessing actually undermined long-term economic health by discouraging productive development. But we can see similar dynamics in other cases as well. Rome's military successes created defensive burdens. The Soviet Union's industrialization created rigid structures that later inhibited adaptation. Fifth, we notice the role of external competition and comparison. Decline is often relative rather than absolute. Rome in the 4th century was still far more sophisticated than most societies of that era. Spain in the 17th century was still wealthy and powerful. But relative to their own earlier peaks, and relative to competitors who were rising, they were weakening. This relative nature of decline is important. It means that a civilization can be objectively prosperous while still being in a state of decline if its competitors are advancing faster. It also means that decline doesn't necessarily involve the absolute destruction of wealth or civilization, just a shift in relative power and influence. Sixth, we see that knowledge of problems doesn't necessarily lead to solutions. In several of our cases, contemporary observers recognized the challenges their societies faced. French finance ministers understood fiscal problems. Soviet reformers recognized inefficiency. But knowledge alone wasn't sufficient. Institutional structures, political constraints, vested interests, and other factors prevented effective responses even when problems were clearly identified. This is perhaps one of the more sobering observations from our journey. It suggests that decline can occur even when people are aware of what's happening, even when solutions are theoretically available. The gap between recognizing a problem and being able to address it can be very large indeed. Finally, we notice that decline is not necessarily irreversible or final. The Byzantine Empire continued for 1,000 years after the Western Empire's fragmentation. Many regions of the former Roman Empire eventually recovered and prospered under different political arrangements. Spain, though no longer a dominant power, remained a significant country. France underwent transformation and emerged as a major power again. Even the former Soviet states, after difficult transitions, have found new arrangements. Decline is about the weakening and eventual end of particular systems and arrangements, not necessarily about the destruction of societies or cultures. Life continues. People adapt. New systems emerge. The end of one empire or arrangement creates space for new developments. As we near the end of our long journey together, let these patterns settle in your mind. Decline is gradual, often invisible to those experiencing it. It involves fiscal and monetary stress, institutional rigidity, the paradox of success, relative rather than absolute weakening, and the gap between knowledge and action. These patterns repeat across different times and places, suggesting fundamental dynamics in how complex systems evolve over long periods. There's no need to draw firm conclusions from these observations. No need to extract specific lessons or make predictions about the future. We've simply been exploring history, examining how empires have weakened over time, noticing patterns that emerge from these diverse examples. The value lies in understanding these processes, in seeing them clearly, not in using them to forecast particular outcomes. Rest now in this understanding. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of centuries we've traveled through together. From ancient Rome's debased silver to Spain's inflowing gold. From France's accumulated debt to Soviet rigidity. We've witnessed the slow working of historical processes, the gradual transformations that shape civilizations over time. Final reflection. We've been together for some time now, you and I. We've travelled through centuries of history, across continents and civilizations. We've examined how great empires, systems that seemed permanent and powerful, gradually weakened over long periods of time. I hope this journey has been peaceful for you, restful, perhaps even conducive to sleep. The stories we've explored aren't about catastrophe or sudden disaster. They're about process, about the slow working of historical forces, about the accumulation of small changes over long periods. They remind us that even the mightiest civilizations are subject to change, that nothing is permanent, that all human arrangements eventually transform or fade. But they also remind us that this process is slow enough that people can live meaningful lives throughout it. The Roman living in the 4th century, the Spaniard of the 17th century, the Frenchman of the 18th century, the Soviet citizen of the 20th century. Each lived in their own time, experiencing their own joys and sorrows, building their own lives, largely unaware of the long-term historical processes playing out around them. Economic systems shape societies profoundly, but they do so quietly, gradually, in ways that are difficult to perceive from within. The currency you use, period. The taxes you pay, the institutions that structure economic life. These all influence your possibilities and constraints. Yet their influence is largely invisible in daily life. You notice them only when they fail dramatically, or when you step back and examine them over long periods, as we've done together tonight. Understanding these long-term processes doesn't give us the ability to predict the future. History doesn't repeat in precise ways. Each era has its own particular characteristics, its own unique combination of factors and circumstances. The patterns we've identified are real, but they don't determine outcomes. They simply help us see more clearly how change unfolds over time. There's something calming, I think, about this long historical view. It reminds us that the issues and anxieties of our own time, which can seem so urgent and overwhelming, are part of larger patterns that have been playing out for millennia. It doesn't diminish the importance of present challenges, but it provides perspective, a sense of continuity with the past and connection to the future. As you lie here, perhaps already drifting towards sleep, let these historical reflections settle into your mind. Let them become part of the background of your thoughts, informing how you understand the world without demanding active attention. There's no test to pass, no facts to remember, just the quiet understanding of how empires have declined over time, how economic systems gradually weaken, how change unfolds slowly across generations. The future will unfold in its own way, shaped by countless factors we can't fully anticipate. The economic systems we live within will continue to evolve, just as they've always evolved throughout history. Some changes will be visible, others subtle. Some will happen quickly, others over decades or generations. But the basic patterns we've explored, fiscal stress, monetary trust, institutional rigidity, the paradox of success, these will likely remain relevant, providing frameworks for understanding change as it occurs. I'm grateful you've spent this time with me tonight, exploring these quiet historical stories. If you found this kind of calm historical storytelling valuable, you may want to stay with us here at Silent Economy. We add new long-form histories quietly over time, always with this same gentle approach, this same respect for your need for peace and reflection. There's no urgency, no pressure, just an invitation to return when you'd like, to explore other historical topics with the same calm, measured pace we've shared tonight. Rest now. Let these thoughts drift and settle. The history of empires is also the history of human adaptation and resilience, of people continuing to live and create and build even as large structures around them slowly transform. This is the story of humanity. Persistence through change. Meaning found in daily life, even amid long-term transformation. The quiet strength to continue regardless of larger historical currents. Sleep well. Wake refreshed. And carry with you, perhaps, a slightly deeper understanding of how economic decline unfolds over time. How empires weaken gradually. How history moves slowly and patiently toward outcomes no one can fully foresee. Thank you for listening. Good night.